Selene sat frozen in front of her laptop, her heart pounding as she read through the email thread. The words blurred together, messages between her husband Daniel and a woman named Kate, filled with plans, lies, and calculated betrayal. There was never a job in London. There was never a fresh start. She looked up slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's no job in London, is there?" Daniel didn't answer. He stood in their nearly empty living room, surrounded by the last of the packed boxes, silent. Everything was gone. Their home, their savings, her grandmother's antique mirror, all sold for a move that was nothing but a cover for his escape. His eyes shifted toward the door. He had no defense, no apology, just guilt in the form of silence. But Selene wasn't broken. Not yet. Because Daniel had no idea what kind of woman he had just betrayed. "My name is Selene Harris. I sold my home, liquidated everything, and gave up my career, so my husband could steal it all and run away with his mistress." Ever wondered what happens when the woman they betray turns out to be a fraud expert? Selene Harris had spent over a decade building a reputation most people in her field only dreamed of. As a senior financial analyst at Parker & Reed in Minneapolis, she was trusted with multi-million-dollar portfolios, known for her sharp attention to detail and the ability to uncover patterns others missed. Her work had prevented costly errors, saved major clients from disaster, and earned her the respect of everyone from interns to executives. She was precise, calm under pressure, and fiercely committed to her profession. But in her personal life, Selene had always led with trust. And that trust, she would later realize, was the very thing Daniel exploited. They met 6 years earlier at a financial technology conference in Chicago. Daniel was charming, articulate, and full of ambition. He worked for a smaller consulting firm at the time, but he had big dreams. Selene was impressed by his energy and vision, and they bonded quickly over long conversations about business, startups, and the future. He made her laugh. He made her feel seen. Within a year, they were married. At first, their marriage seemed like a partnership. Selene had just received a major promotion and used her bonus to help Daniel launch his own consulting business. He said it was an investment in their future, and she believed him. When the first business failed, she took on extra projects to support them financially. When he wanted to try again, she took out a loan against her 401. Each time he promised this would be the breakthrough. Each time he came up short. But Selene kept believing. Family and friends started to notice the imbalance. Her cousin Nina, especially, was vocal about her concerns. Over coffee one afternoon, she leaned in and said, "Selene, don't you think it's strange how Daniel never wants you involved in any of his business decisions? He's literally a financial analyst." Selene had smiled and dismissed it. "He doesn't want to burden me," she'd replied. "Besides, he's my husband. I trust him." Looking back, those words stung the most. Because trust had been her default setting. It was how she approached life. But Daniel had used that trust like currency, cashed it in little by little, until she was left with nothing. When Daniel came home 3 months ago, his eyes bright with excitement and news of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity in London, Selene didn't hesitate. She was tired, burned out from long hours and back-to-back quarters of intense work. The idea of a new chapter, a fresh start overseas, sounded like exactly what they needed. Daniel insisted they travel light, sell the house, liquidate their accounts, start over completely. And so she did. She sold the first home she had ever owned, a beautiful 2-breakfastman where she had carefully picked every piece of furniture. She donated her reading nook armchair, gave away the vintage lamps she'd inherited, even sold her grandmother's antique mirror, the only physical thing she had left of her. It was hard, but she told herself it was for the greater good. A sacrifice for their shared dream. But the dream never existed. Daniel had pushed for the liquidation, not because they were starting over, but because he needed her money to fund a new life with someone else. As Selene stared at her now empty living room, the truth came crashing in. She hadn't just trusted the wrong man, she had built a life on promises he never intended to keep. And while he had spent years manipulating her behind a smile, Her biggest mistake was believing that love could not lie. It happened the morning they were supposed to leave. The moving truck had already come and gone. Selene's suitcase stood by the door. The apartment was nearly empty, just a few boxes left to carry out. While Daniel took a shower, Selene opened her laptop to check the final details of their travel arrangements. That's when she saw it, an email notification she didn't recognize. The subject line mentioned Kate. Her stomach sank. She clicked it open, then clicked again. Within seconds, she was reading through an entire thread, dozens of emails between Daniel and Kate. It wasn't just an affair. It was a plan. A house had been purchased in Austin 3 days ago, using funds wired from one of Selene's accounts. Kate was listed as the buyer. Daniel had orchestrated everything. There was never a move to London. When he emerged from the shower, she didn't even look up from the screen. "There is no job in London, is there?" she asked quietly. Daniel froze. He didn't even try to lie. His eyes flicked to his suitcase. "How long?" she demanded. "It months," he said eventually. "It just happened." And then the plan evolved. His words, so casual, felt like a knife twisting in her chest. She asked about the money, even though she already knew the answer. Over $600,000. Gone. Her savings. Her retirement. The equity from her house. All of it transferred into accounts Daniel had encouraged her to open for ease of international banking. She had trusted him so completely that she never questioned it. That trust was now her ruin. Daniel picked up his suitcase and stood in the doorway. "You'll land on your feet. You always do." Then he laughed. Selene stood in the silence he left behind. Her first call was to Parker and Reed. Her boss, Linda, answered. When Selene explained what had happened, her voice trembling, Linda didn't hesitate. "Your job is secure," she said firmly. "Take whatever time you need. But listen to me, you need to report this. What Daniel and his accomplice have done isn't just wrong, it might be criminal." Selene nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks for the first time. Her next call was to her bank, but the news there was less comforting. Since she had authorized the transfers, even in false pretenses, they said their hands were tied. "There's very little we can do," the representative said gently. Selene hung up and looked around the apartment. Nothing was left. No furniture, no photos, no safety net. Just boxes and memories of a life that no longer existed. But beneath the heartbreak, something inside her shifted. She was a financial analyst. Her job was to follow the money, to spot fraud before others could see it. And Daniel had forgotten one important thing. Selene wasn't just his wife. She was a professional. And now, she was done crying. It was time to investigate. Selene moved into her cousin Nina's guest room the day after Daniel walked out. The room was small but quiet, tucked in the back of the house, with just enough space for a desk and a folding chair. Within 48 hours, it had transformed into what looked like a financial crime scene. Printouts lined the walls. Highlighters, notepads, and color-coded folders covered every surface. Selene wasn't sleeping much, but she didn't care. Every night, she stayed up tracing transfers, mapping transactions, and rebuilding her shattered life one data point at a time. Using her credentials from Parker and Reed, she remotely accessed the same software she used to detect fraud for major clients. It felt personal and professional at the same time. And it worked. As she followed the digital footprints, the truth emerged, and it was worse than she imagined. Daniel and Kate hadn't just scammed her. They had been running a small-scale Ponzi scheme through Daniel's fake consulting business, targeting multiple individuals and promising massive returns. Selene identified 6 other victims across different states. The pattern was clear. They would lure each victim with charms, show falsified gains for a few months, and disappear with the money. She reached out to each victim individually, presenting her findings with careful precision. Some were shocked. Others already suspected they'd been duped. One by one, they agreed to cooperate, providing statements, wire confirmations, and any messages they still had. With every piece of information, Selene built a larger and more detailed picture of the fraud. She was relentless. In the middle of one long night, Nina brought her a cup of coffee and paused at the doorway. "You look like you haven't slept in days," she said softly. Selene didn't look up. "I can't sleep. Not while they're living in that house in Austin, bought with my money." That house became her next target. She traced the $380,000, 0 cents, used for the purchase. The funds had passed through 3 different banks before landing in Kate's account. That gave Selene an idea. She reached out to Marcus, an old friend from college, who now worked as a fraud investigator at the bank where Kate had opened the final account. Over coffee, she laid everything out. At first he was stunned, then deeply concerned. "Selene, this is serious, like federal-level serious," he said after reviewing her documents. He didn't hesitate. Marcus flagged the account for suspicious activity, which triggered an automatic freeze, right as Daniel and Kate were trying to close on a second property. The timing was perfect. Within hours, Selene received a text from an unknown number. "What did you do?" It was Kate. The panic in her tone, even in a single message, was unmistakable. Selene didn't respond. Instead, she turned back to her charts and timelines, her mind sharper than ever. This wasn't just about getting her money back anymore. It was about exposing everything, and making sure Daniel and Kate never did this to anyone else again. Kate's first sign of panic came the morning after Marcus froze the accounts. A text lit up on Selene's phone from an unfamiliar number. "What did you do?" Selene stared at it for a moment, then locked her screen without replying. She owed Kate nothing. While Kate scrambled to figure out why her money was suddenly inaccessible, Selene was already 10 steps ahead. She had gathered enough evidence to move beyond private retaliation. Now it was time to go public. Selene opened her laptop and logged into Daniel's email using the same password he'd used since college, one he had foolishly reused for years across every major account. Inside, she found everything: detailed conversations between Daniel and Kate, forwarded financial documents, and a spreadsheet that tracked every transfer from every victim. It was all there, and it was damning. Selene compiled the most incriminating emails into a single document. With one final glance, she selected all of Daniel's professional contacts, colleagues, clients, board members, and business partners, and hit send. The fallout was immediate. Within hours, Selene's phone lit up with messages from people shocked, appalled, and angry. Daniel's name was now associated with fraud. His phone, Selene imagined, must have been flooded with calls he couldn't ignore. His LinkedIn was quietly deactivated later that evening. By morning, 2 companies had issued press releases cutting ties with his consulting firm. His reputation, so carefully built on ambition and image, had collapsed in less than 24 hours. That night, Daniel texted her for the first time since walking out. "You've ruined me." Selene read the message without flinching. Then she typed back 2 words: "I'm not done." With the full support of the victims she had contacted, Selene submitted a detailed case file to the FBI. It included bank statements, signed testimonies, property records, and a timeline of transfers dating back nearly a year. She arranged to meet with 2 agents, one from financial crimes, the other from cybercrime. She arrived with every document in order, each piece of data meticulously labeled. The agents listened, flipping through the folders as Selene walked them through the scheme. Kate, it turned out, had a history. Agent Roberts leaned back in his chair and said, "We've been watching Catherine Bennett for a while. She's been tied to similar scams in 3 other states. We didn't have enough to move until now." Selene handed them one last document, a spreadsheet she'd built from scratch, tracing every transaction across 6 victims, totaling nearly $1,700,000, 0 cents. The agents were visibly impressed. "What you've put together here," one of them said, "this isn't just a personal vendetta, this is a criminal enterprise." Selene exhaled for the first time in days. It felt like oxygen. They thanked her for her cooperation and promised to follow up. As she walked out of the federal building, the wind felt different. She wasn't the woman who had been tricked, used, and discarded. She was the woman who fought back, and had the skill set to make it count. Daniel had stolen her trust, her savings, and her future. But in trying to break her, he had unlocked something stronger. Selene wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting. And the people who had laughed behind her back were now the ones running scared. The arrests came quicker than anyone expected. Within 2 weeks of Selene's meeting with the FBI, Daniel was taken into custody. He had returned to Minneapolis thinking he could contain the fallout, only to be met at his front door by 2 federal agents. The evidence Selene had provided was airtight. Meals, bank records, financial trails that exposed every layer of deception. Daniel was offered a deal: reduced prison time in exchange for full cooperation and testimony against Kate. With nowhere to run, and his professional world already in ashes, he accepted. Kate, on the other hand, tried to disappear, but her luck finally ran out at Miami International Airport. She was caught attempting to board a flight to the Cayman Islands using forged documentation. Her bags were filled with prepaid debit cards, a fake passport, and thousands in cash. The FBI froze her remaining assets, and when they ran her name through their system, the puzzle pieces clicked into place. Kate Bennett was not just a scheming mistress. She was a seasoned con artist with active investigations in 3 states, each involving fraud, identity manipulation, and financial exploitation. Selene's meticulous work had done more than uncover a personal betrayal. It had unraveled a multi-state criminal enterprise. Her tracking system, custom-built and powered by Parker and Reed's software, was so effective that the FBI requested continued access. With her permission, they began using her framework as a case study to track similar schemes nationwide. Back at Parker and Reed, her contribution hadn't gone unnoticed. Linda, her longtime boss, called her into the executive office one afternoon and handed her a formal promotion letter. Effective immediately, Selene was now head of the firm's newly trained fraud detection and risk analysis division. It came with a team of her choosing, a higher salary, and an open invitation to speak at financial compliance conferences around the country. Her trauma had been transformed into innovation, and her pain had paved the way for something far more powerful: purpose. With the dust finally settling, Selene turned her attention inward. She didn't want anything extravagant, but she did want something of her own again. She purchased a modest 2-bedroom cottage on the edge of a quiet neighborhood just outside the city. It was hers, bought with her own name, her own funds, and her own peace of mind. Nina helped her move in, hanging curtains and arranging plants in the sunroom. They laughed over takeout and shared long silences where no words were needed. Bit by bit, Selene began rebuilding, not just her finances, but her life. She adopted routines again, walked every morning, kept fresh flowers in the kitchen, and created boundaries she would never again let anyone cross. She became a mentor at work, offering guidance to junior analysts, and speaking candidly about emotional blind spots that can exist even in the sharpest minds. Her story spread beyond the office walls. Industry panels asked her to share how personal betrayal led to professional innovation. What began as one woman's loss became a blueprint for resilience. Daniel received 5 years after his full cooperation. Kate, with no prior cooperation and a stack of felony charges, was sentenced to 12. Selene didn't attend their trials out of spite or vengeance. She sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, not for them, but for herself. She needed to see the chapter close, and when the handcuffs clicked shut, she didn't feel triumph. She felt release. For the first time in a long time, Selene lived without the weight of what had been done to her. She no longer measured herself by what she had lost. Her focus was on what she had reclaimed: her voice, her control, and her future. Justice hadn't come in the form of revenge. It had come in the form of a woman who refused to stay broken, who chose to fight back not with fury, but with facts. And through that strength, Selene rewrote the ending to a story meant to destroy her. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered the final sentences. Kate Bennett stood in front of the bench, her expression tight and unreadable, dressed sharply as if she still believed she could talk her way out of what was coming. But there was no charm left to wield, no lies left to spin. She was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for wire fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft. Her assets across 5 states had been seized, and multiple civil lawsuits from victims were already pending. Daniel sat beside her, shoulders slumped, hollowed out by the months of fallout. His sentence was lighter, reduced due to full cooperation and testimony. But his life outside those walls had already collapsed. His career was over. His reputation shredded. The same ambition that had once drawn Selene to him had ultimately become the weapon he used to destroy himself. Selene sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, hands folded in her lap. She didn't feel satisfaction or revenge, just closure. It wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about accountability. Seeing Kate let out in handcuffs, knowing Daniel would finally face real consequences, it didn't erase what had been done to her, but it made breathing easier. It made healing possible. After the sentencing, Agent Roberts approached her outside the courthouse. "We've recovered nearly 80% of the misappropriated funds," he told her. "Some victims will be made whole. You should receive most of what was taken within the next 6 months." Selene nodded, grateful but no longer driven by the numbers. She had already moved beyond that chapter. Her house was stable, her job fulfilling, and her identity no longer tethered to the losses. What mattered now wasn't what she had once built with Daniel. It was what she had built without him. Back at Parker & Reed, Selene's new fraud detection division had become a model for other firms. She spent her days overseeing high-profile investigations and mentoring rising talent, especially young women trying to carve out their place in finance. She shared her story, not with shame, but with purpose. It had happened to her, and it could happen to anyone. But what mattered most was how you responded, how you turned knowledge into action. Selene never forgot how it felt to sit alone in that empty rental apartment, blindsided by betrayal and surrounded by broken promises. But now, those memories didn't weigh her down. They reminded her of how far she'd come. Her cousin Nina often stopped by her new home for dinner or coffee. They'd sit on the back porch talking about life, love, and trust. Sometimes they laughed about the absurdity of it all, and sometimes they fell into comfortable silence. But no matter the mood, Selene always felt anchored, grounded in who she had become. One afternoon, she had received an email from a young analyst named Kendra. The subject line read, "Thank you." In it, Kendra described how Selene's story had inspired her to leave a toxic relationship and pursue a promotion she'd once thought she didn't deserve. Selene read it slowly, then smiled. She had reclaimed far more than just her money. She had reclaimed her voice, her confidence, and her belief in herself. Kate and Daniel were now footnotes in a larger journey. They were cautionary tales, not defining chapters. Selene's life was no longer about surviving them. It was about thriving beyond them. What she had built from the ruins wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was hers. Justice had arrived not in fire, but in clarity, and that clarity gave her everything she needed to begin again, on her own terms. 1 year later, Selene Harris stood in front of a packed auditorium at a National Finance and Compliance Summit. She wore a crisp blazer, a subtle smile, and the kind of presence that comes only from surviving something that should have destroyed you. As she walked attendees through her case study on fraud detection, the audience listened intently, not just because of her expertise, but because of the quiet authority in her voice. This wasn't theory. It was lived experience. Her fraud detection program, once built from the ashes of her own financial ruin, had now been implemented by 6 major firms across the country. It had prevented over $12 million, 0 cents in potential fraud, in its first year alone. What began as a personal mission had become a corporate model. Selene had turned pain into process, and process into power. But her greatest pride came not from accolades or financial stats. It came from the women she mentored. She launched an initiative called Women Watch, pairing young female analysts with seasoned professionals to guide them through both technical challenges and workplace politics. Selene met with them monthly, offering advice that blended hard numbers with emotional intelligence. She didn't shy away from telling her story. She wanted them to understand that even in moments of devastation, there was a path forward. Especially for women willing to reclaim control. At home, Selene's life was quiet, purposeful, and deeply her own. Her small cottage was filled with books, fresh flowers, and the human of stability. She had learned to enjoy solitude, not as loneliness, but as peace. Weekend mornings were reserved for long walks, and evenings were often spent on her porch with Nina, laughing over memories and talking about whatever came next. There were no more secrets, No more late-night doubt, just space to breathe and rebuild. Selene no longer measured herself against what she had lost. Daniel's betrayal no longer haunted her. Kate's schemes no longer held weight. Those were closed chapters in a book that had turned unexpectedly, but not tragically. Because Selene hadn't been defined by what was done to her, she had been defined by what she did next. She had responded with clarity, with calm, and with unstoppable resolve. Her journey became more than personal redemption. It became an example of how to rise with integrity. Industry panels invited her to speak. Financial institutions asked her to consult. Students quoted her in research papers. Selene Harris had become a name synonymous with precision, resilience, and ethical leadership. She never sought revenge. She sought understanding. And through that understanding, she built something unshakable. Her story, once painful to even speak aloud, had become a tool for change, not just in corporate systems, but in hearts, minds, and futures. What Daniel and Kate took from her, she had more than replaced. Not with bitterness, but with brilliance. Not with noise, but with strength. And in every room she entered, she carried that strength like a light. Proof that even in the aftermath of betrayal, you can become your own greatest rescue. The morning sunlight poured through the windows of Selene's kitchen, casting a soft glow across the wooden countertops and shelves lined with ceramic mugs and small potted herbs. She stood barefoot, sipping chamomile tea in the silence of her home, a place built not on someone else's promises, but entirely on her own strength. The TV played quietly in the background, a morning news anchor reporting that Kate Bennett's final appeal had been denied. Her 12-year sentence would stand. Selene didn't react outwardly. She simply took another sip of tea and glanced at the screen for a moment before turning her attention back to her laptop. A new fraud case file was open. This one involved an elderly couple scammed out of their retirement savings by a fraudulent investment group. Selene had already begun highlighting inconsistencies in the digital trail. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, her focus sharp. Another victim. Another chance to help, another opportunity to take her pain and transform it into action. Her life wasn't dramatic anymore, and that was the greatest gift of all. She no longer lived in the shadow of what had been taken from her. She lived in the light of what she'd chosen to rebuild. Sometimes the justice we seek isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's the quiet knowledge that we rose from the wreckage, not as victims, but as something stronger. Sometimes it's simply reclaiming our life